The gunshot echoed across the plains as Willa Hayes crouched behind the overturned wagon, her heart pounding like a war drum against her ribs. The year was 1876, and what should have been a routine journey from Denver to Santa Fe had turned into a nightmare when outlaws ambushed their wagon train at dawn. Now, as the last surviving member of her party, she clutched her father's old revolver with trembling hands, counting the 2 bullets she had left. "Don't waste your ammunition, miss," a deep voice called from somewhere to her right. "I've got 4 of them in my sights already." Willa's breath caught in her throat as she peered around the edge of the wagon. A tall figure on horseback appeared through the dust, rifle raised, face shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat. 3 bodies already lay motionless on the ground, and the remaining outlaws were retreating, disappearing into the distance like cowards facing judgment. The stranger dismounted with the fluid grace of someone who spent more time on horseback than on foot. As he approached, Willa kept her revolver trained on his chest, unwilling to trust anyone after what she'd witnessed. "I mean you no harm," he said, raising his hands slightly. "Name's Bryce Sullivan." "How do I know you're not with them?" Willa challenged, her voice steadier than she felt. He stepped closer, and the morning sun finally illuminated his features, a strong jawline dusted with stubble, eyes the color of a summer storm, and a small scar cutting through his left eyebrow. Not handsome in the conventional sense, but striking in a way that made it difficult to look away. "If I was, you'd already be dead," he replied matter-of-factly. "Now are you hurt?" Willa slowly lowered her weapon, the reality of her situation sinking in. She was alone in the middle of nowhere, her companions dead, supplies scattered across the prairie. "Just scratches, They killed everyone else." Bryce nodded grimly, surveying the carnage around them. "Those were Hawkins' men. They've been terrorizing this territory for months now." He knelt beside her, his gaze assessing. "You got family waiting somewhere?" "No," Willa admitted, the word hollow in her throat. "My parents died last winter. I was heading to Santa Fe to stay with my mother's cousin, but—" She gestured helplessly at the destroyed wagon train. "Santa Fe's still 4 days' ride from here," Bryce said, squinting at the horizon. "My ranch is half a day east." "You can rest there, figure out your next move." Willa hesitated, studying the stranger who had appeared like an avenging angel in her darkest moment. There was something in his eyes, a steadiness, a quiet strength that made her want to trust him. Still, she'd learned long ago that survival sometimes meant skepticism. "Why would you help me?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Because leaving a woman alone out here would weigh on my conscience, something fierce, Miss Hayes, Willa Hayes, Miss Hayes." He tipped his hat slightly. "I promise you'll be safe at my ranch. After that, if you still want to continue to Santa Fe, I'll make sure you get there." The alternative was staying alone with the dead, waiting for the vultures or worse to find her. Willa nodded and accepted his outstretched hand. Bryce helped her gather what supplies could be salvaged, including her small trunk of possessions. He insisted on burying the dead, a task that took several hours under the relentless sun. Willa worked alongside him, her hands blistering as she helped dig graves for people who had been strangers to her just days ago when they'd joined the wagon train. When they finally mounted Bryce's horse, a magnificent chestnut stallion he called Thunder, Willa found herself pressed against the solid warmth of his back, arms wrapped hesitantly around his waist. As they rode away from the makeshift cemetery, she allowed herself a moment of weakness, resting her forehead against his shoulder and letting silent tears soak into the fabric of his shirt. If Bryce noticed, he gave no indication, maintaining a respectful silence as they put distance between themselves and the scene of such violence. It was only when they stopped to water the horse at a small creek that he finally spoke again. "It'll get easier," he said quietly, handing her a canteen. "Not better, but easier." Willa took a long drink, studying him over the rim. "You sound like you know." Something dark flashed across his face before he looked away. War has a way of teaching that lesson. The Confederate War had ended 11 years ago, but Willa recognized the shadows it still cast in the eyes of those who'd fought. Her father had carried those same shadows until his dying day. "Were you at Gettysburg?" she asked. Bryce nodded once sharply. "And Antietam." and a dozen lesser hells no one bothers to name in the history books. They lapsed into silence again as they continued their journey. The landscape gradually changed from open prairie to more varied terrain, rolling hills dotted with cottonwoods and the occasional stand of pines. By late afternoon, they crested a hill and Bryce pulled Thunder to a stop. "There it is," he said. Sullivan Ranch. Below them, a modest but well-maintained homestead spread across a gentle valley. A sturdy log house with a wide porch stood as the centerpiece, flanked by a large barn, corral, and several outbuildings. A creek cut through the property and cattle grazed in the distance. It wasn't grand, but it spoke of hard work and care. "It's beautiful," Willa said honestly. Bryce made a non-committal sound, but she felt him straighten slightly with pride. "It's home." As they approached, a gray-haired man emerged from the barn, followed by a younger man who bore enough resemblance to Bryce to be a relative. "That's Jasper, my foreman," Bryce explained, "and my younger brother, Daniel." Both men watched with obvious curiosity as Bryce helped Willa dismount. Her legs nearly buckled after hours on horseback, and his hands lingered at her waist to steady her, warm and strong through the fabric of her dust-covered dress. "Bringing home strays again, Sullivan?" Jasper called, his weathered face breaking into a smile that softened the words. "Miss Hayes needs our hospitality for a time," Bryce replied, his tone making it clear this wasn't a subject for teasing. "Hawkins' gang hit her wagon train this morning." Both men's expressions sobered immediately. Daniel stepped forward, offering a respectful nod. "Madam." "I'm sorry for your trouble. We've got a spare room that's yours for as long as you need it." Willa managed a tired smile. "Thank you, I won't impose longer than necessary." "Nonsense," Jasper said gruffly. "Sullivan Ranch has always been a haven for those who need one." Bryce placed a gentle hand at the small of her back, guiding her toward the house. "Let's get you settled. Mrs. Landry, our cook, will have supper ready soon, and she'll have my hide if we're late." The interior of the house was unexpectedly welcoming, clean, well-ordered, with simple but comfortable furnishings. Photographs and small keepsakes suggested it had once been a family home, though Bryce had mentioned no wife or children. The promised spare room was small but pleasant, with a narrow bed, washing stand, and a window overlooking the distant mountains. Most importantly, it had a door that locked, a detail Willa noted with relief. Mrs. Landry, a robust woman with kind eyes and nimble hands, provided her with clean clothes that had belonged to the late Mrs. Sullivan, Bryce's mother. Willa presumed and drew her a bath in a copper tub behind a screen in the kitchen. The hot water was a luxury Willa hadn't expected, and she nearly wept with gratitude as she washed away the dust, blood, and terror of the day. By the time she joined the men for supper, dressed in a simple blue dress that was slightly too large but blessedly clean, she felt almost human again. Conversation around the table was carefully kept to neutral topics: the weather, the cattle, a broken fence that needed mending. No one pressed her about the attack or her plans, for which Willa was grateful. Instead, she observed the easy camaraderie between Bryce, Daniel, and Jasper, the clear respect they shared despite the occasional good-natured ribbing. It was Bryce she found herself watching most, though she tried not to be obvious about it. There was something compelling about the way he moved, the quiet authority he carried without arrogance. When he spoke, everyone listened, not from fear but from genuine regard. After the meal, Daniel produced a battered checkerboard, challenging Jasper to a game they'd apparently been battling over for years. Mrs. Landry retired to her small cottage behind the main house, leaving Willa alone with Bryce on the porch as the sun set in a spectacular display of orange and purple. "Thank you," she said finally, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, "for everything today." Bryce leaned against the porch railing, his profile gilded by the fading light. "No need for thanks." "There is," Willa insisted. "You saved my life, you buried strangers with respect, you've given me shelter and asked nothing in return." He turned to look at her then, his expression unreadable. "What kind of man would I be if I'd done otherwise?" "The kind I've met too often," Willa replied softly. Something in her tone made his eyes sharpen. "Someone's hurt you before." It wasn't a question, but Willa answered anyway, surprising herself with her candor. My fiancé. After my father fell ill, William decided I wasn't such a good match after all. The family fortune had dwindled to nothing paying for doctors. She gave a bitter laugh. He married the banker's daughter instead. I heard they're very happy in their new home, the one my father built. Bryce's jaw tightened. Then he's a fool, Miss Hayes. Willa, she corrected him. After today, I think we've moved beyond formalities, Mr. Sullivan. Bryce, he returned with the ghost of a smile. They fell silent again, watching as stars began to appear in the darkening sky. It was a comfortable silence, the kind shared by old friends rather than new acquaintances thrown together by tragedy. You should get some rest, Bryce said eventually. Tomorrow will be soon enough to decide your next steps. Willa nodded, suddenly aware of the bone-deep exhaustion weighing her down. Good night, Bryce. Good night, Willa. As she turned to go inside, she caught him watching her, his expression softening in a way that made her heart stutter. For just a moment, she forgot the horror of the morning, the uncertainty of her future, and simply existed in the warm regard of a man who had asked for nothing but had given everything when she needed it most. For the first time since leaving Denver, Willa slept without nightmares. The next morning, Willa woke to the smell of coffee and the sounds of a working ranch coming to life. Sunlight streamed through her window, and for a disorienting moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then the events of the previous day crashed back, and she closed her eyes against the wave of grief and fear that threatened to overwhelm her. A soft knock at her door provided welcome distraction. Miss Hayes, it was Mrs. Landry's voice. Breakfast is ready whenever you are, no rush. Willa dressed quickly in another of the borrowed dresses, this one a faded green that complemented her auburn hair. She'd lost her hairbrush in the attack, but found a simple wooden comb on the washing stand and did her best to tame her unruly curls. The kitchen was empty except for Mrs. Landry, who was kneading dough with practiced efficiency. The men ate at dawn, she explained, gesturing to a plate of biscuits, eggs, and bacon keeping warm near the stove. Bryce said to tell you he'd be back by midday, something about checking the north pasture. Willa nodded, trying to ignore the small pang of disappointment. Thank you for breakfast and for the clothes. Mrs. Landry smiled, her hands never pausing in their work. Those belonged to Margaret Sullivan, Bryce's mother. She passed 5 years ago, but I think she'd be pleased they're being used by someone who needs them. What about Bryce's father? Willa asked, curious about the family whose home she'd entered. Died during the war. Typhoid, not bullets, though that was small comfort to Margaret. She raised those boys alone after that, turned this place from a struggling homestead into a proper ranch. Pride colored Mrs. Landry's voice. When she passed, Bryce took over. He was just 23, but he had a good head on his shoulders. Always did. Willa ate slowly, considering this new information. It explained the quiet competence she'd observed in Bryce, the sense that he'd carried responsibility from a young age. And Daniel, he seems quite different from his brother. Mrs. Landry chuckled. Like night and day, those two. Daniel's got a quick smile and quicker tongue, takes after their mother that way. Bryce is more like their father speaks when he's got something to say, not just to fill silence. She paused her kneading, giving Willa an appraising look. Bryce doesn't bring people home, Miss Hayes. Not in all the years I've worked here. You must have made quite an impression. Willa felt heat rise to her cheeks. He was being kind, nothing more. I was in trouble. Mrs. Landry hummed noncommittally, returning to her dough. There's kindness, and then there's the way he looked at you across the table last night. Before Willa could respond to this unsettling observation, Daniel appeared at the kitchen door, hat in hand. Morning, Miss Hayes. Mrs. Landry, Jasper's asking if you've got any of that liniment left. His shoulders bothering him something fierce. Mrs. Landry nodded toward a cupboard. Top shelf, blue jar. Tell him not to be such a stubborn old mule next time Doc Jenkins is passing through. Daniel grinned, retrieving the jar. I'll pass along the message, minus the mule part maybe. He turned to Willa. Bryce mentioned you might be wanting to send a letter to your people in Santa Fe. Let them know you're safe. I'm riding into town later if you'd like to have something ready. Willa hadn't even thought that far ahead, but the suggestion made sense. Yes, thank you. I'll write something after breakfast. When Daniel left, Mrs. Landry provided paper, pen, and ink, then tactfully busied herself outside, giving Willa privacy to compose her letter. It was harder than she'd expected, trying to explain the attack and her current situation to a cousin she barely knew. In the end, she kept it simple. She was safe, would arrive later than planned, and was being looked after by a respectable rancher and his household. She was just sealing the envelope when hoofbeats approached the house. Looking out the window, Willa saw Bryce dismounting, his movements betraying fatigue. He spoke briefly with Jasper, handed over his horse, then headed toward the house. When he entered, he paused in the doorway, seeming surprised to find her alone in the kitchen. "You're up. Good." "How are you feeling?" "Better," Willa said honestly. "Your home is very peaceful." Bryce nodded, removing his hat and running a hand through his hair, leaving it charmingly disheveled. "Found something of yours," he said, reaching into his saddlebag. He pulled out a small, leather-bound book, its edges charred but the contents intact. Willa gasped, crossing the room without thinking. "My journal. I thought it was lost with everything else." "It was half buried near where your wagon went over. Must have fallen out during the attack." He handed it to her, their fingers brushing momentarily. Willa clutched the journal to her chest, overwhelmed by this small connection to her past life. "Thank you. This means more than I can say." Bryce's expression softened as he watched her. Something in his gaze made Willa acutely aware of her appearance, hair hastily combed, wearing a borrowed dress, standing too close to a man she barely knew. "You're staring again," she said softly, echoing words she'd spoken to William a lifetime ago when their courtship was new and she'd still believed in romance. The cowboy's lips curved slightly. "And you're still beautiful." The simple statement, delivered without artifice or expectation, stole Willa's breath. Unlike William's practiced compliments, Bryce's words held no calculation, just a quiet truth he seemed almost surprised to have spoken aloud. The moment stretched between them, fragile and charged, until the back door banged open and Mrs. Landry returned, arms full of fresh laundry. Bryce stepped back, clearing his throat. "I should clean up," he said, voice rough. "Been riding since dawn." He disappeared down the hallway, leaving Willa standing in the kitchen, journal pressed to her heart, Mrs. Landry's knowing gaze burning into her back. The next several days fell into an unexpected rhythm. Each morning, Willa woke early, helping Mrs. Landry with breakfast and household tasks. The routine was comforting, giving structure to days that might otherwise have been consumed by grief and uncertainty. Bryce was often gone from sunrise until midday, overseeing ranch operations with Jasper and the handful of cowhands who worked the property. Daniel, who Willa learned was not only younger but more inclined toward business than ranching, handled the accounts and regular trips to town. In the afternoons, when the summer heat made outdoor work unbearable, Bryce would often return to the house. These were the hours Willa found herself looking forward to most: quiet conversations on the porch, Bryce teaching her to play chess, or simply sharing companionable silence while she wrote in her recovered journal and he reviewed ledgers or correspondence. On the fourth day, Daniel returned from town with a letter from Willa's cousin in Santa Fe. The message was brief but kind. Willa was welcome whenever she arrived, but there was no need to rush her journey if she was safe and comfortable where she was. "Well," Bryce said when she shared the news over supper, "seems you've got options now." Willa nodded, surprised by her own reluctance to leave. "I should continue to Santa Fe soon. I've imposed on your hospitality long enough." "You're not imposing," Daniel said immediately. "Right, Bryce. Miss Hayes is welcome to stay as long as she likes." Bryce's eyes met Willa's across the table. "The choice is yours," he said simply, "but Daniel's right. You're welcome here." That night, unable to sleep, Willa slipped outside to the porch, wrapped in a shawl against the evening chill. The vast prairie sky stretched overhead, stars scattered like diamond dust across black velvet. She'd never seen stars like this in Denver, where city lights and coal smoke dimmed the heavens. "Couldn't sleep," Bryce's voice came from the shadows at the far end of the porch. Willa startled slightly, then relaxed when he stepped into the moonlight. "Too much thinking," she admitted. "You?" "Same." He moved to stand beside her at the railing, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him but not so close as to be improper. "What were you thinking about?" "My parents," Willa said, surprising herself with her honesty. "What they would want for me now. My father always said a person makes their own path, but my mother believed in destiny." She smiled sadly. "They argued about it often, but lovingly." "And what do you believe?" Bryce asked quietly. Willa considered the question, watching the moonlight silvering the distant hills. "I think perhaps they were both right. We make choices, but sometimes events conspire to put us exactly where we need to be, even if it's not where we planned." Bryce nodded, his profile strong and thoughtful in the moonlight. "Like finding yourself on a ranch in the middle of nowhere instead of in Santa Fe." "Exactly like that," Willa agreed softly. They stood in silence for a long moment before Bryce spoke again. "I rode out to the north boundary today. There's a place there, a small valley with a natural spring, wildflowers everywhere this time of year." He hesitated, then added, "I thought you might like to see it, tomorrow if you're inclined." The invitation hung between them, simple on the surface but weighted with unspoken meaning. This wouldn't be a casual ride to pass the time, it would be something more deliberate, more personal. "I'd like that," Willa said, her heart quickening. Bryce smiled then, a rare full smile that transformed his serious face and made him look younger, unburdened. "Good, we'll go after breakfast." The next morning dawned clear and perfect, as if the weather itself approved of their plans. After breakfast, Bryce brought around 2 horses Thunder for himself and a gentle mare named Daisy for Willa. "She's steady," he assured her, helping Willa mount. "Won't give you any trouble." They rode at an easy pace, Bryce pointing out landmarks and sharing stories about the ranch, how his father had won the original plot in a poker game, how his mother had expanded it acre by acre through smart trades and sheer determination, how he and Daniel had built most of the outbuildings with their own hands after the war. "You love this land," Willa observed, watching the animation in his usually reserved expression. "It's part of me," Bryce agreed. "During the war, thinking about this place was what kept me sane. The idea that somewhere, no matter what hell I was walking through, these hills and valleys were still here, unchanged." They crested a rise, and the valley Bryce had described spread before them, a hidden gem nestled between rocky outcroppings. True to his word, wildflowers carpeted the ground in a riot of color, and a small spring fed a crystal-clear pool before meandering away as a narrow stream. "Oh," Willa breathed, genuinely awestruck. "It's like something from a fairy tale." Bryce's expression was soft as he watched her reaction. "I've never shown anyone this place before. Not even Daniel knows about it." The significance of his admission wasn't lost on Willa. This wasn't just a pretty spot, it was something personal, private, that he was choosing to share with her. They dismounted near the spring, letting the horses graze on the lush grass while they spread a blanket Mrs. Landry had packed, along with a simple picnic lunch. Sitting side by side, they ate and talked, conversation flowing more easily than ever before. Willa found herself sharing stories of her childhood in Denver, her father's work as an architect, her mother's passion for music and literature. In turn, Bryce spoke of growing up on the ranch, his time at war, his dreams for the future of Sullivan land. "I want to build something that lasts," he said, plucking a wildflower and twirling it between his fingers. "Not just a successful ranch, but a legacy, a place that will still be standing 100 years from now, providing for generations to come." "That's a beautiful ambition," Willa said sincerely. "So different from what I've known. In Denver, everyone was always chasing the next opportunity, the next profit. Few people thought beyond their own lifetimes." Bryce studied her face. "And what do you want, Willa Hayes?" "What future are you chasing?" The direct question caught her off guard. What did she want? Before the attack, she'd been focused solely on survival, reaching her cousin, finding work, rebuilding some semblance of a life after losing her parents and her home. But now, "I want to belong somewhere again," she said finally, the truth of it resonating in her chest. "I want purpose, connection." She met his gaze steadily. "I want to matter to someone." "You matter," Bryce said, his voice low and intense. "To me." The admission hung in the air between them, honest and unadorned. Willa's breath caught as Bryce slowly, deliberately reached out to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "I know it's too soon," he continued, "and that you've got decisions to make about your future, but I wanted you to know that I've never felt about anyone the way I feel about you." Willa's heart thundered in her chest. "We barely know each other," she whispered, even as her body leaned instinctively toward his. "Don't we?" Bryce challenged softly. "I know that you're brave in the face of tragedy, that you're kind to Mrs. Landry and patient with Jasper's old war stories. That you laugh at Daniel's terrible jokes even when they aren't funny, that you write in your journal every night and prefer coffee to tea." His thumb traced her cheekbone. "I know that you're the first thing I think about when I wake up and the last thing on my mind before I sleep." Willa closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the raw honesty in his words. When she opened them again, Bryce was watching her with such tenderness that it made her chest ache. "You're staring again," she murmured, echoing their exchange from days earlier. This time, his smile was immediate. "And you're still beautiful, more beautiful every day." Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Bryce leaned forward until his lips met hers in a kiss so gentle it was barely more than a whisper. Willa's hands found their way to his shoulders, steadying herself as he deepened the kiss, one arm slipping around her waist to draw her closer. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Bryce rested his forehead against hers. "Stay," he said simply. "Not just for now. Stay with me here. We can write to your cousin, explain. You can still visit Santa Fe whenever you wish, but make this your home." The offer was unexpected in its directness, yet somehow not surprising at all. In the short time she'd known him, Bryce Sullivan had proven himself to be a man who spoke his mind and heart with equal clarity. "This is very sudden," Willa said, trying to be practical even as her heart raced with possibilities. "Is it?" Bryce asked. "Or is it just unexpected? Different from what you planned?" His hand found hers, fingers intertwining. "Sometimes life puts us exactly where we need to be, even if it's not where we thought we were going." Her own words from the night before reflected back to her with new meaning. Willa looked around at the hidden valley with its carpet of wildflowers, the peaceful horses grazing nearby, and this man who had saved her life and now offered her a future. "I need time," she said finally. "Not to decide if I have feelings for you. I do, more than I thought possible after so short an acquaintance. But to be sure I'm not just grasping at safety after everything that's happened." Bryce nodded, disappointment visible in his eyes, but acceptance too. "Time is something I can give you. As much as you need." The ride back to the ranch was quieter, both lost in thought, but not uncomfortably so. As they approached the house, however, Willa noticed unusual activity: extra horses in the corral, Jasper and Daniel conferring urgently near the barn. Bryce straightened in his saddle, instantly alert. Something's wrong. They urged their horses forward and Daniel jogged to meet them. "Sheriff Blackwood's here," he said without preamble. "With news about Hawkins' gang." Bryce dismounted quickly, then helped Willa down. "What's happened?" "They hit the Miller place last night," Daniel said grimly. "Burned it to the ground. Sheriff's forming a posse to go after them." A chill ran through Willa despite the warm afternoon. The Miller's ranch couldn't be far if the sheriff was here recruiting. Inside the house, they found a weathered man with a silver star pinned to his vest sitting at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee. He stood when they entered, hat in hand. "Sullivan," he nodded to Bryce, then turned to Willa with a respectful dip of his head. "Madam, Sheriff Blackwood. I understand you had your own run-in with Hawkins' boys recently." "Miss Hayes was the sole survivor of the wagon train attack last week," Bryce confirmed, his hand settling protectively at the small of Willa's back. The sheriff's expression darkened. "Then you'll understand why we need to stop these men before they hurt anyone else. They've gone too far this time, killed Tom Miller and his oldest boy, took everything of value." "How many in the posse?" Bryce asked, his tone shifting from the gentle one he'd used with Willa to something harder, more resolute. "8 so far. Need at least 4 more to have a fighting chance. They're holed up in the Diablo Canyon, according to our tracker." Willa felt Bryce tense beside her. "That's a death trap if they know you're coming." "Which is why we need men who know the territory," the sheriff countered. "Men like you, Sullivan. The request hung in the air, and Willa found herself holding her breath. She had no right to ask Bryce to stay, not when other lives were at stake. But the thought of him riding into danger made her blood run cold. "When do you ride out?" Bryce asked finally. "Dawn tomorrow. Need to gather more men today, supplies too." Bryce nodded once, decision made. "I'll be ready, Daniel too, if he's willing." "Already said he was," the sheriff confirmed, finishing his coffee and standing. "I'll be back at first light. We'll get these bastards, Sullivan, for Miss Hayes and the Millers both." After the sheriff departed, the ranch became a flurry of activity, weapons cleaned, provisions packed, plans discussed. Willa moved through it all in a daze, helping where she could but increasingly aware of a growing dread in the pit of her stomach. By nightfall, preparations were complete. Daniel retired early, but Bryce found Willa on the porch, staring out at the star-filled sky as she had so many nights before. "I wish you weren't going," she said when he joined her, not bothering to hide her fear. Bryce took her hand, his grip warm and steady. "I have to, you know that." "I know," Willa acknowledged. "The same way you had to help me that day by the wagon. It's who you are." She turned to face him fully. "But that doesn't make it any easier to watch you ride toward danger." Something shifted in Bryce's expression, a softening, a wonder. "You're worried for me." "Of course I am," Willa replied, surprised he would doubt it. "I care for you, Bryce, more than I should after so short a time." He drew her closer, one hand rising to cup her cheek. "I'll come back to you," he promised, his voice low and certain. "And when I do, we'll talk about that future." "About you staying," Willa nodded, forcing herself to be brave. "I'll be here waiting." This time when they kissed, there was an urgency that hadn't been present in the valley, a recognition of the danger tomorrow might bring, the fragility of new beginnings. Willa clung to him, memorizing the feel of his arms around her, the scent of leather and pine that seemed uniquely his. "Come inside," Bryce murmured against her hair when they finally broke apart. "It's getting cold." Hand in hand, they walked back into the house, the night ahead both too short and endless in its possibilities. Morning came too quickly, gray light barely breaking over the eastern hills as the sheriff's posse gathered in the ranch yard. 12 men in total, grim-faced and determined, checking weapons and saddles with practiced efficiency. Willa stood on the porch, wrapped in the shawl Mrs. Landry had given her, watching as Bryce conferred with the sheriff and other riders. He looked different today, harder somehow, the gentle rancher replaced by a soldier preparing for battle. The transformation should have frightened her, but instead it reassured her. This was a man who knew how to survive. Just before mounting, Bryce approached the porch. In full view of the waiting posse, he took Willa's hands in his. 2 days, he said. 3 at most, then I'll be back. Willa nodded, fighting back tears that would only make this harder for both of them. Be careful, all of you, she added, including Daniel in her glance. Keep an eye on the place while we're gone, Bryce said, his thumbs tracing small circles on her wrists. Help Mrs. Landry and Jasper if they need it. I will, Willa promised, recognizing the request for what it was, a way of giving her purpose, a role during the anxious days ahead. Bryce hesitated, then reached into his pocket, producing a small, worn object. Take this, he said, pressing it into her palm. My father gave it to me before I left for war, said it would bring me home safe. Willa opened her hand to find a simple silver compass, tarnished with age but still functional. The initials TS were engraved on the back. Thomas Sullivan, she presumed. Bryce, I can't, please, he interrupted gently. I'd like to think of you having it while I'm gone. The significance of the gesture wasn't lost on her. This wasn't just a token, it was a family heirloom, something precious, something that symbolized both protection and return. I'll keep it safe, Willa said, closing her fingers around the compass, until you come back for it. Bryce's eyes held hers for a long moment before he leaned down to press a swift, hard kiss to her lips. Then he was striding toward Thunder, mounting in one fluid motion, taking his place beside the sheriff. As the posse rode out, Willa stood watching until they disappeared over the distant ridge, the compass clutched tightly in her hand like a talisman. The next 2 days passed with excruciating slowness. Willa threw herself into ranch work, helping Mrs. Landry with household tasks and even assisting Jasper with lighter outdoor chores. The physical labor was a welcome distraction from constant worry, and the activity helped her sleep at night, though her dreams were troubled. On the morning of the third day, Willa was hanging laundry when Jasper called out from near the barn. "Riders coming!" She dropped the sheet she was holding, heart leaping into her throat as she rushed to where Jasper stood, shading his eyes against the sun. "Is it them? Can you tell?" "Too far yet," the old foreman said, but his posture was tense, alert. "Go tell Mrs. Landry, could be our boys coming home hungry." Willa hurried to the kitchen, where Mrs. Landry was already preparing extra food, apparently having spotted the approaching riders herself. "How many?" the older woman asked without looking up from her work. "Couldn't tell yet," Willa admitted, moving to the window that offered the best view of the approaching trail. "Jasper thinks it might be them, Mrs. Landry nodded, her hands steady as she worked, but Willa noticed the extra care she was taking. These weren't just routine preparations. These were the actions of a woman readying welcome for men returning from danger. By the time the riders were close enough to identify, Willa was nearly sick with anticipation. She stood on the porch, one hand shielding her eyes, the other clutching Bryce's compass in her apron pocket. "It's them," Jasper confirmed, coming to stand beside her. "All of them, looks like." That's something to be thankful for. The relief that flooded through Willa was so intense she had to grip the porch railing to stay upright. As the riders drew closer, she could make out individual figures, the sheriff at the lead, Daniel beside him, and there, toward the back, Bryce on Thunder. Only when they entered the yard did Willa notice that Bryce was slumped slightly in his saddle, and that his shirt, once blue, was stained dark across one shoulder. "He's hurt," she gasped, already moving toward him as the men dismounted. Daniel intercepted her, his own face sporting a nasty bruise. "It's not as bad as it looks," he assured her quickly. "Bullet grazed him. Doc Jenkins was with the Ross Creek posse. He patched Bryce up before we rode back." Willa barely heard him, her attention fixed on Bryce as he dismounted stiffly, handing Thunder's reins to one of the ranch hands. When he turned and saw her, his exhausted face transformed with a smile that made her heart stutter. She crossed the distance between them in quick steps, stopping just short of throwing herself into his arms. "You're hurt," she said, eyes fixed on the bandage visible beneath his torn shirt. "I've had worse," Bryce replied, voice rough with fatigue but warm with affection. "It really is just a graze." Unable to help herself, Willa reached up to touch his face, needing the physical reassurance that he was truly here, alive and whole despite his injury. "You came back. I promised I would." His hand covered hers, turning to press a kiss to her palm. "And I always keep my promises, Willa Hayes." Behind them, the sheriff was explaining to Jasper and Mrs. Landry what had happened, how they'd tracked Hawkins' gang to the canyon, engaged in a fierce gunfight, and ultimately captured or killed all 8 outlaws. 2 of the posse had been wounded besides Bryce, but none fatally. "Justice has been served," the sheriff concluded, accepting a cup of coffee from Mrs. Landry, "and those devils won't be terrorizing anyone else." The next few hours were a blur of activity: horses cared for, wounds rechecked, a hearty meal served to the returning men before most of the posse continued on to town. By sunset, only the sheriff remained, planning to stay the night before returning to his office the next day. Bryce, despite protests from both Willa and Mrs. Landry, insisted on taking a proper bath once the kitchen was clear of dinner guests. 3 days of trail dust and dried blood, he said firmly. "I'm not spending another minute like this if there's hot water to be had," while Mrs. Landry prepared the bath. Willa helped Bryce remove his ruined shirt, her touch gentle as she unwrapped the bandage to assess his wound. The bullet had indeed merely grazed his shoulder, leaving an angry furrow that had been neatly stitched by the doctor. "You were lucky," she said softly, rewrapping the wound with fresh bandages. Bryce caught her wrist when she finished, his eyes serious. "It wasn't luck, Willa. It was knowing I had something to come back for." The simple declaration stole her breath. In that moment, any lingering doubts she might have harbored about her feelings or his vanished like morning mist under a strong sun. "I'm staying," she said, the decision crystallizing with perfect clarity. "Not just for now. If your offer still stands, I want to make a life here with you." Joy bloomed across Bryce's face, transforming his fatigue into something luminous. "Are you certain? What about your cousin in Santa Fe? I can visit her," Willa said, suddenly sure of her path. "But this feels like where I'm meant to be, where I belong." She smiled, remembering their conversation in the Wildflower Valley. "Sometimes life puts us exactly where we need to be." Bryce pulled her closer, mindful of his injured shoulder, and kissed her with a tenderness that spoke volumes. "I love you, Willa Hayes," he murmured against her lips. "I think I have since that first day when you stood your ground with that revolver even though you were terrified." "I love you too," Willa replied, the words feeling both momentous and completely natural, as if she'd been waiting her whole life to say them to this man. Later that evening, after Bryce had bathed and rested, they sat together on the porch swing, watching as stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky. The compass he had given her rested between them, a symbol of the journey that had brought them together and the future stretching before them. "We could be married before winter," Bryce suggested, his arm around her shoulders, drawing her close against the evening chill. "Build on that addition to the house I've been planning. Make it ours, not just mine." Willa leaned into his warmth, contentment settling deep in her bones. "I'd like that, though Mrs. Landry will insist on a proper celebration, I'm sure." "Let her," Bryce chuckled. The ranch could use something joyful to mark the calendar by. They fell silent, comfortable in each other's company and the simple pleasure of being alive together under a vast prairie sky. So much had changed in such a short time, lives lost and found, dangers faced and overcome, a future neither could have predicted now unfolding before them. "You're staring again," Willa murmured without opening her eyes, feeling his gaze on her face. Bryce's laugh was soft in the darkness. "And you're still beautiful, always will be to me." In that moment, with the man she loved beside her and the home they would build together surrounding them, Willa knew with absolute certainty that she had found her place in the world. Not where she had planned to be, but exactly where she was meant to be all along. The months that followed were filled with preparation and anticipation. True to Bryce's prediction, Mrs. Landry took charge of wedding arrangements with enthusiastic efficiency, transforming what might have been a simple ceremony into a celebration that the entire county seemed determined to attend. "You've become something of a legend," Daniel teased Willa one evening as they reviewed the growing guest list. "The brave woman who survived Hawkins' gang, won the heart of the county's most eligible bachelor, and tamed the notorious Sullivan brothers." "I've hardly tamed anyone," Willa laughed, though she had noticed how the ranch had changed since she'd decided to stay. There were fresh curtains in the windows, flowers on the table, and a softening to the masculine edges of the home that had nothing to do with physical alterations, and everything to do with the way the men now moved through spaces she had touched. Bryce's injury healed cleanly, leaving only a faint scar to mark where the bullet had grazed him. By October, he was fully recovered and working alongside his men to complete the addition to the house, before winter set in 2 new rooms that would be their private quarters, separate from the main house but connected by a covered walkway. "A compromise," he explained when Willa questioned the unusual design, "close enough to be part of the household, far enough for privacy." The thoughtfulness behind the design touched her deeply. It was yet another example of how Bryce considered her needs and comfort, integrating her into his life while respecting her independence. As the wedding date approached, set for the first Sunday in November, Willa found herself increasingly reflective about the journey that had brought her to this point. One evening, sitting by the fire with her journal, she realized with a start that it had been exactly 4 months since the day Hawkins' gang attacked her wagon train. 4 months since she'd lost everything she'd thought mattered, only to find everything that truly did. She was still contemplating this when Bryce entered, snow dusting his shoulders from the season's first flurries. His face, cold, reddened but relaxed, brightened at the sight of her. "Deep thoughts?" he asked, hanging his coat and moving to warm his hands by the fire. Willa smiled up at him. "Just reflecting on how quickly life can change. 4 months ago today, I was on that wagon train, heading for a future I thought I wanted." Understanding dawned in Bryce's eyes as he calculated the date. Without a word, he crossed to the cabinet where he kept important documents, retrieving a small package wrapped in brown paper. "I was saving this for our wedding," he said, sitting beside her on the sofa, "but perhaps today is more fitting." Curious, Willa unwrapped the package to find a rectangular wooden box, beautifully carved with a pattern of wildflowers. Opening it revealed a delicate silver locket on a fine chain. "Oh, Bryce," she breathed, lifting it carefully. "It's beautiful. Open it," he encouraged softly. Inside, she found a tiny pressed wildflower, a perfect blue columbine, the same variety that had carpeted the valley where they'd shared their first kiss. "How did you manage this?" she asked, touched beyond words. "I went back to the valley the day after we returned from chasing Hawkins," Bryce admitted. "Picked it myself, had the jeweler in town set it in the locket." He took her hand, his expression serious. "I wanted you to have something that marked the beginning of us. Something beautiful born from difficult times." Tears pricked at Willa's eyes as she closed the locket, holding it against her heart. "Will you put it on me?" Bryce's fingers were surprisingly deft as he fastened the chain around her neck, the locket settling perfectly at the hollow of her throat. When he finished, his hands lingered, warm against her skin. "4 months ago, I thought I knew what my life would be," he said quietly. "Running the ranch, looking after Daniel, maybe expanding our holdings someday, I never imagined." He trailed off, searching her face. "I never imagined you, Willa Hayes, how completely you would change everything." Willa leaned into his touch, overwhelmed by the depth of feeling between them. "Soon to be Willa Sullivan," she reminded him with a smile. 10 more days," Bryce nodded, his thumb tracing her lower lip. "Though I confess, they feel like an eternity." The kiss they shared was tender at first, a gentle affirmation, before deepening into something more urgent, a promise of the life they would soon share completely. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Willa rested her forehead against his. 10 days, she echoed. "After everything we've been through, I think we can manage that." The wedding day dawned clear and cold, the first Sunday of November bringing a crystalline sky and frost that glittered on every surface. From her window in the main house, where tradition had dictated she spend her last night as a single woman, Willa watched the ranch come alive with activity, guests arriving on horseback and in wagons, ranch hands directing traffic, Mrs. Landry orchestrating an army of helpers from neighboring farms. A soft knock at her door preceded the entrance of Daniel, looking uncharacteristically formal in a new suit, his usually unruly hair tamed for the occasion. "Almost time," he said, grinning. "Bryce is pacing a hole in the barn floor, in case you were wondering." Willa laughed, smoothing the skirt of her wedding dress, a creation of ivory silk that Mrs. Landry and 3 other women had worked on for weeks. "Is he nervous?" "Terrified," Daniel confirmed cheerfully. "Not about marrying you, about forgetting his vows or tripping over his own feet in front of half the county." His expression softened. "He's never wanted anything as much as he wants this day to be perfect for you." The simple truth of this statement warmed Willa from within. "It already is perfect," she said, "because it's ours." Daniel offered his arm with a formal bow that made her smile. "Then let's not keep my brother waiting any longer. I promised him I'd deliver his bride on time, and Sullivan men always keep their promises." The ceremony itself was a blur of emotion and beauty. Later, Willa would remember fragments the way Bryce's eyes never left hers as she walked toward him on Daniel's arm, the slight tremor in his hands as he placed the ring on her finger, the cheer that went up from the assembled guests when the minister pronounced them husband and wife. The celebration that followed lasted well into the evening, with music and dancing, food and laughter, speeches and toasts that ranged from heartfelt to hilarious. Through it all, Bryce remained at her side, his hand often finding hers as if to reassure himself that she was real, that this day was real. Happy. He murmured as they shared their first dance as husband and wife, the fiddler playing a slow, sweet melody that allowed them a moment of relative privacy amidst the crowd. "Completely," Willa answered honestly. "Are you?" Bryce's smile was answer enough, but he put it into words anyway. "More than I knew was possible." His arm tightened slightly around her waist. "You know what this means, don't you?" "What?" I get to stare at you every day for the rest of our lives, he said, echoing the exchange that had become a cherished joke between them. And you'll still be beautiful every single day. As the stars emerged above their celebration and the future stretched before them like an open road, Willa knew with absolute certainty that the path that had led her here through loss and pain, chance and choice had been the right one all along. In Bryce Sullivan's arms, in the home they would build together, she had found not just safety or comfort, but a love worth every step of the journey. And when he whispered those words again that night, in the privacy of their new rooms, Willa's heart was full with the knowledge that some stories, against all odds, do find their way to a perfect ending. "You're staring again," she murmured, her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "And you're still beautiful," came the immediate reply, followed by a kiss that promised a lifetime of such moments, quiet, honest, completely theirs. Outside their window, the vast prairie stretched beneath a canopy of stars, unchanging yet ever new, much like the love they had found in each other's arms, a love born in the wild chaos of the West, tempered by danger, and destined to endure through all the seasons of their lives together. 5 years later, the sound of childish laughter echoed across the Sullivan ranch as Willa stood on the porch, watching her husband chase their 3-year-old son Thomas through the spring grass. Little Emma, not quite a year old, bounced on her hip, cooing and reaching toward her father and brother with pudgy hands. "Papa, fast." Thomas shrieked with delight as Bryce pretended to stumble, allowing the boy a momentary lead before scooping him up in one fluid motion and spinning him around. "Not fast enough for you, little man," Bryce laughed, his face alight with joy as he carried Thomas toward the porch. "Look at your mama and sister watching us. Aren't we the luckiest men in Montana territory?" Thomas nodded solemnly, his dark curls so like his father's bobbing with the movement. "Lucky," he agreed, though Willa suspected he didn't fully grasp the concept yet. "Indeed we are," Bryce said, mounting the steps to join Willa and Emma. He pressed a kiss to his daughter's head, then leaned in to give Willa a proper greeting. "Good morning, Mrs. Sullivan." "Good morning yourself, Mr. Sullivan," she returned, leaning into his kiss. Even after 5 years of marriage, the simple exchange never failed to warm her from within. "Daniel's coming for dinner. Apparently he has news." Bryce raised an eyebrow. Miss Catherine finally said yes. "He wouldn't tell me," Willa laughed, "but I suspect so. He's been courting her for nearly a year now." "About time," Bryce said, shifting Thomas to his shoulders where the boy perched like a triumphant king. "Sullivan men aren't known for their patience in matters of the heart." Willa gave him a knowing look. "Oh really? As I recall, you were quite patient with me." "That was different," Bryce protested with a grin. "I knew you were worth waiting for." His expression softened as he gazed at her, taking in the picture she made with their daughter on her hip. "You're staring again," Willa said softly, the familiar exchange still carrying the same weight as it had the first time. "And you're still beautiful," Bryce replied without hesitation. "More so every day." The simple truth in his words made Willa's heart swell. 5 years, 2 children, and countless challenges later, they had built a life together that exceeded every dream she'd ever had. The ranch had prospered under their joint care, expanding to include new pastures and a small apple orchard that had been Willa's special project. The house had grown too, accommodating their growing family and the frequent visitors who found Sullivan Ranch a welcoming haven. "Come inside," Willa said, adjusting Emma on her hip. "Breakfast is waiting and we have a busy day ahead." As they moved into the home they had created together, Willa caught sight of the silver compass, now framed alongside her locket in a display case in the entry hall. These treasures, along with Thomas's baby shoes and a pressed flower from Emma's christening, formed a visual history of their family, reminders of the journey that had brought them together and the love that continued to guide their way forward. Later that evening, after Daniel had indeed announced his engagement to Catherine Reynolds and been thoroughly congratulated by all, Willa and Bryce stood on the porch once more, watching as the first stars appeared in the twilight sky. The children were asleep, the house quiet behind them, the future stretching before them like the vast prairie itself, full of promise and possibility. "I was thinking," Bryce said, his arm around her waist. "About that day by the overturned wagon, how close I came to riding past without stopping." Willa leaned into his embrace, remembering that terrible day that had led to everything good in her life. "But you did stop. Best decision I ever made," Bryce murmured, turning her gently to face him. "Well, second best, marrying you was the best." "Charmer," Willa teased, though she never tired of hearing his declarations, however many years passed. "Only for you," he promised, capturing her lips in a kiss that held all the passion of their early days together and all the depth of the years they'd shared since. When they parted, Bryce's eyes held hers with the same intensity they always had, as if he were seeing her for the first time and the thousandth time simultaneously. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I think I'll still be staring at you like this when we're old and gray." "And I'll still be telling you that you're staring," Willa replied, her hands resting on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palms. "And I'll still be saying that I'm beautiful," she finished for him, smiling. "I know." As the night deepened around them, stars scattered like diamonds across the velvet sky, Willa thought about the long, unlikely journey that had brought her to this place, this man, this life. From tragedy to triumph, from loss to love, their story had unfolded in ways neither could have predicted but both now recognized as destiny. In Bryce Sullivan's arms, on the land they both cherished, surrounded by the family they had created together, Willa had found not just a home or a husband, but a completion of herself she hadn't known she was seeking. And in her eyes, he had found the reflection of his best self, the man he had always had the potential to become. "I love you," Bryce whispered against her hair as they stood wrapped in each other's embrace, the vast Montana night enfolding them like a blessing. "I love you too," Willa answered, the words as true and necessary as breathing. "Today, tomorrow, always." And as they turned to go inside, to the warmth of their home and the promise of all the days to come, both knew with unshakable certainty that some loves truly are destined to last forever, especially those born in the wild, unpredictable heart of the West, where courage and fate combine to create the most enduring stories of all.